In the last section, we moved our data into an API endpoint and improved the shape of our data tree a little bit. In this section, we'll talk about Redux, the state manager that works very well with React. We'll cover Redux store, reducers, actions, and also middlewares. In this first video, we'll start by configuring a simple Redux store. A store is at the heart of any Redux application, and to configure a store, we need to create a reducer function. We'll also see how to read the store state from a React component. On the front end, our application so far is a pure React application. We don't have any state manager. In fact, our state manager is React itself. We're putting information on the state, and we're using setState everywhere to manage the state. So it's time for us to explore moving this state management into another entity, which in our case, we're going to use Redux. Redux is a state container for any JavaScript application, but it's very popular with React. So I'll work through an example Redux flow using our application here and explain things as we use them. So our first step is to bring in Redux to our front end side of the application. So we're going to npm install Redux. And once we have Redux, I'm going to go ahead and start the front end application one more time. And now I have Redux to use. As you can see here in the basics of Redux, what we need to make a full Redux application is actions, reducers, and a store. So we're going to create all of those. Let's start with the store. I'm going to put everything under the source directory. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file, call this file store.js. And I'm going to create another file for the reducers. Let's call this file reducers.js. And let's also create another file for actions. Actions.js. Perfect. So we have store, we have reducers, we have actions. So for the store part, we're going to import create store from Redux. Create store is a utility function that allows us to create a Redux store using a reducer object. So we're going to need to implement a reducer for this create store to work. Let's call this reducer main reducer. And we're going to import it from our reducer file that we just created. Now, all we need to do to actually create a Redux store is to call the create store function using the main reducer as an argument. But instead of exporting a singleton object here in this module, we're going to export a function that creates and returns the store. So let's call this function configure store. It'll be a simple function that actually returns the exact thing that we have here. So this will return create store for reducers. And let's go ahead and export this function. So we're going to export default configure store. So now let's go ahead and create our reducer. A reducer is just a function. So we're going to call this function main reducer. It's a function that takes the initial state, and it also takes an action object, and it returns a new state. So usually in a reducer, we have a switch statement that switches on the action.type. We'll talk about that later. And we'll have cases for every action type, but usually the default operation is just to return the state untouched. And we're going to go ahead and export to default main reducer. So this is it for the reducer business. And we'll come to the actions later. But for now, let's go ahead and try to use this store in our application. So in the book list component, we're going to import configure store from our store object, which is up one level. And we're going to go ahead and create a new store and put that store as an instance property on the book list element that we're using. So we're going to do this.store equal configure store and call that. And then we always read the state from the Redux store. So we don't do this anymore. We're going to go ahead and read the state directly from the Redux store. So the API is this.store.getState. Now, to get things running without an error, we need an initial state because we just removed the initial state here. So we're going to go to the reducers, and we have two ways of doing an initial state. We can do the initial state directly here, and we should definitely have an empty object here to start the state. But also, when we create a store, the second argument here could be the initial state. And we definitely need an initial state because our books array need to be initialized as an empty array for our application to work. So let's take a look if we have any errors now. I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and we're still doing the fetch. So we're going to go ahead and kill this fetch because this is managing the state directly in the React. We also can't do any set state directly. So I'm going to comment out delete book and add book. And we don't really have API endpoint to manipulate data on the server yet. So now when I save everything and reload the application, we'll see that the array of books is empty because it's coming from the Redux store and its initial data here.